Samson woke up feeling pretty pleased with himself. Yesterday, he'd slaughtered a whole town full of Philistines single-handed. Not bad for a day's work, eh? Bang, bang, bang. There was a knock on the cave door. It was a delegation of Israelites. Well done, they said. Well done, mister. Let's slaughter everyone in sight without thinking about the consequences. Do you realise what's happened? We all had nice little businesses, nice little shops, nice little delicatessens until yesterday. Now the Philistines are going to kill 6 Israelites every hour on the hour until we hand you over. Let's hope you've got the common decency to turn yourself in. I think so, said Samson. Right, come on, let's tie you up. Suppose you better had, said Samson, and he held out his hands. But when he got down to the bottom of the mountain, he could see Philistines, hundreds of them, all with bloodthirsty looks on their faces. And if there was one thing that Samson couldn't stand, it was Philistines. He took a deep breath. His stomach bulged, his chest bulged, his biceps swelled to the size of armadillos, and pow! The air was full of tiny little bits of broken rope, and he was free! At his feet, there was the skeleton of a dead donkey, all bleached and picked clean by vultures. He bent down, broke off the jawbone, and whirled it round his head like a great toothy boomerang. Voof! He threw it straight into the Philistine pack. Zoop, 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 zoop. It scythed through 20 Philistine necks and meow came right back to him. Zoop, 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 zoop. 20 more. Zoop, 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 zoop. 20 more. The Israelites looked on in amazement as Samson obliterated the Philistines. When it was finished, he stood there panting and dripping with sweat and looked up at the sky. God of the Israelites, he cried. I'm dying for a drink. Nothing happened. Please. Still nothing. I did say please. There was a rumbling deep in the bowels of the earth. Then a great column of water shot up from the dried river bed. The Israelites looked on, totally gobsmacked, as Samson stepped over it, opened his mouth and took great gulps of it, gargled in it, showered and washed his teeth with it, and laughed and laughed and laughed. Now, Samson had one big problem. Women. They absolutely adored him. You might not think this sounds too appallingly dreadful a problem, but for Samson, it was suicide, literally. He finished his shower, walked down to the Philistine city of Gaza just to buy himself some after-shower talc, ambled into the local department store, strolled up to the cosmetics counter, and bam! He was being served by the most wonderful, the most beautiful, most Philistine girl he had ever met in his entire life. He looked at her, she looked at him, and it was love at first sight, just like the coffee ad. Oh, wondrous lady, he said, your eyes warm my heart like the sun rising over Mount Carmel. I'm sorry, but people do tend to talk garbage at moments like this. Let me book us a small room at the local Holiday Inn so I can spend the evening gazing into your wondrous eyes. And they left, arm in arm, out of the department store with all the Philistines going, it's Samson, clobber him, clobber him. But nobody dared. 5 hours later, Samson and his girlfriend were getting into some pretty serious eye-gazing up in their hotel room. And the Philistines were down below, having a council of war. We won't duff him up in the town, they said. He'll only start breaking windows. We'll wait till he's outside the city gates. Then we'll ambush him, and the entire adult population of Gaza will tear him to pieces. Then they turned to the gatekeeper. We'll go to bed now, they said, and as soon as he's outside those gates, you raise the alarm. Have you got that? 8.5 hours later, Samson was getting pretty fed up with all this eye-gazing, and he tiptoed out of the hotel and lumbered down towards the massive city gates, where the gatekeeper was sitting high up on top of them with his mouth open. You're waiting till I've gone outside, aren't you? Called Samson. Then you're going to raise the alarm. Might, said the gatekeeper, and he lifted up his ladder so that Samson couldn't get at him. "Then I'd better not go outside, had I?" said Samson, and he wrapped his massive arms round the gateway and he heaved the gates out of their foundations and then lumbered off. "Am I outside yet?" Samson asked when they'd gone a few hundred metres. "No," replied the gatekeeper. "Can I get down, please?" "Am I outside now?" Samson asked when they'd gone about half a mile. "No." "Now?" Samson asked when they'd gone about 5 miles. "No," said the gatekeeper. Samson carried the gates and the gatekeeper right to the top of the nearest mountain, and then he dumped them. Then he opened the gates and walked right through. "Right," he said. "Now you can sound the alarm." And off he went. "Help!" cried the gatekeeper. "Help! Samson's outside the city gates!" But he was so far away from Gaza that nobody heard him. Samson walked all through the night till he came to the next town and, poof, he still hadn't got his after-shower talc. So he ambled into a department store, strolled up to the cosmetics counter and bang! Exactly the same thing happened again. The most wonderful, most beautiful, most Philistine girl he'd ever seen, love at first sight, coffee ad, sun rising over Mount Carmel, and off they strolled arm in arm to the local Holiday Inn, with the Philistines going, "It's Samson! It's Samson! Clobber him!" But the difference was that this particular Philistine girl was a bit special. She was called Delilah, and she could twist any bloke she fancied round her little finger just like that. Her girlfriends couldn't stand her, but blokes thought she was wonderful. Samson was completely hooked. He wanted to stay in that hotel room forever and ever. Delilah didn't know. She was getting a bit bored with all this eye-gazing. "I'll go and get your after-shower talc," she said. "Quite frankly, you could use it." She shut the door behind her. "Delilah! Delilah!" The mayor, the high priest, the fire chief and the chief of police were all hiding round the corner. "Find out what makes him so strong and we'll burst in and tie him up." "What's in it for me?" said Delilah, opening her compact and powdering her nose. "It's your patriotic duty," they hissed. She took out her lipstick. "And we'll pay you 50,000 silver pieces." "You're on," said Delilah. Samson was having a snooze. "Darling," said Delilah, "you're so big and strong, it makes me all fluttery and weak and girly." "Oh, that's nice," said Samson drowsily. "Now, just suppose I wanted to make you all weak and helpless. How'd I do it?" "Well," said Samson, "if you tied 7 new bowstrings round my wrists, I'd be as weak and helpless as a little bunny rabbit." Meow. The door opened a tiny bit and the mayor stuck his hand through, wiggling 7 new bowstrings. Time up, he whispered. "Oh, look, I just happened to have 7 new bowstrings in my makeup bag," she said playfully. "Let's see what happens when I tie them round your wristy-pisties, shall we?" Samson smiled and he held out his hands. In a flash, the 7 bowstrings were tight round his wrists. "Oh dear," said Delilah, "the Philistines are coming and my beloved's hands are tied. What will he do?" The Philistines burst into the room. Samson snapped the bowstrings, picked up his attackers and chucked them out of the window. "It's all right, darling. I was only joking," he said to Delilah. Delilah pulled a really grumpy face. "Oh, that's horrid," she said. "You were fibbing. I'm all upset. Now tell me really, what honestly makes you all weak and soppy? Go on, tell me." 7 new ropes," said Samson, "what no one's ever used." Meow. The door opened again, and there was the fire chief's hand with 7 new ropes. "Oh, what a coincidence," said Delilah. "Look what I've got." And she tied him up. "Oh dear," she shouted, "the Philistines are coming and my beloved's hands are tied. What will he do?" The Philistines burst into the room and Samson hurled them out of the window. Delilah was really beady this time. After all, there were 50,000 silver pieces at stake. She sulked, she wheedled, she stamped her foot, she cried, she sulked again. All right,
it, shouted Samson. I'll tell you, just stop pulling that horrible face. It's my hair, my 7 beautiful dreadlocks. I grew them for the God of the Israelites. If they're cut off, I'm powerless.
Meow. There in the doorway was the high priest's hand with a huge pair of scissors. The rest was easy. Snip, snip, snip went Delilah, and the 7 dreadlocks lay on the pillow. Then the Philistines burst in, and did Samson hurl them out of the window? No. He just lay there on the bed, as weak and helpless as a little bunny rabbit. Then they pinned him down, then they chained him with huge bronze chains, then they blinded him.
Help me, Delilah! Help me!
He called. But Delilah just sat there, painting her nails and reading a magazine. Then the mayor wrote the invitations. Come and see who we've captured. Samson, the so-called Israelite hero, trussed up like a turkey in a supermarket. And 3 weeks later, people turned up for the biggest party the Philistines had ever held. There were punk bands and weird dancing and light shows. And when the party was really humming, they dragged Samson in to the middle of the room and they started jeering and leering at him and spitting at him. And Samson was staggering around in chains, totally blind and totally humiliated. And after a while, the Philistines got bored with him and they went back to their weird dancing, and Samson was on his own, and the rage began to swell in his stomach, and he whispered, Lord God of the Israelites, give me the strength to take revenge on the Philistines for putting out my eyes. And then he put his hands to his head and he smiled. They may have hacked off his dreadlocks, but his hair had been growing back for 3 weeks now, and he staggered over to the big 2 central pillars and he heaved. And there was a groaning sound, and he heaved again, and the ceiling began to crack, and he looked up into the sky and shouted, Let me die with the Philistines! And the whole building came crashing to the ground. No one survived, not the mayor, not the fire chief, not Samson, nor any of the Philistines. And Samson's mum and dad and his brothers and his sisters took Samson's body and they buried it high up in the mountains. And when they stood round his grave, they could see the whole of Canaan. On one side, the towns and villages of the Israelites. On the other, the towns and villages of the Philistines. Maybe someday the fighting would stop. Maybe someday someone would come along who'd make Canaan free for the Israelites like their God had promised. Maybe what they needed was a king. Now that was an idea.